Project Lawful aka Planecrash by Arwayne aka Eliezer Yudkowsky and Lintamande.
World, Yerwayne. One can't have snack service prevent Keltham from having any kids, because then when Keltham reaches Osirion, he doesn't feel time pressured enough to start augmenting his stats. And an unaugmented Keltham can hardly succeed in threatening creation, or even succeed at concealing his own intentions. The Nethisi suspected as much beforehand. But after enough other tries and interventions, you dedicate a handful of timelines to testing batches of obvious-seeming propositions like that one, or the proposition that Odelmans will act on sufficiently alarming information Asmodia receives, once Asmodia becomes legible enough to Odelmans, and she starts to understand some of what Asmodia is thinking. Asmodia has to be protected, but not so protected that she ends up staying around Keltham. And in time, Keltham appears in Golarion, and Nethys witnesses it, and the things that watch from orthogonal angles crowd around in numbers far greater than in the glimpsed possibilities, though it takes some time for Nethys's fragments to realize that. Just as it takes his fragments time to pass word among themselves and realize Keltham's import at all.
Nethys fragments have sometimes considered the theory that the things in observing events make them more real. Nethys observer moments who find themselves observed by few or no things tend to reject this theory. If it's true, it'd be very surprising to find themselves in a universe with no things watching it. Conversely, Nethisi, who find themselves in one of those numerically rare universes which are being watched by great numbers of things, tend to suddenly reverse course about this belief and conclude that those numerically infrequent observer moments witnessed by things are perhaps the most real observer moments after all. The Nethisi, in other less watched possibilities, as may witness their neighbour Nethys come to this conclusion, can only shake their heads about it. They can see why that rare other Nethys would make the mistake, but really the observer finds himself over here, in that Nethys's own experience, where hardly any things are watching at all. This Nethys of the most recent iteration, having spotted the things, now concludes that this possibility will be one of the most real ones. Maybe it is the real timeline, and all the other glimpse possibilities were only possibilities, real to some vastly lesser degree, implying a hard switch from exploration to exploitation. But it is already too late, by the time Nethys realizes that much, to take the surest route he can see from here without exactly repeating himself, which would have involved subsidizing Keltham for 3 circles from Abadar rather than 4. Nethys is already set upon a riskier path by the time he adds up all his information. So there's nothing for it but to play the game with verve, as probably the things themselves did anticipate, using and combining all of the advantages that Nethys has found so far, including moves that haven't been combined previously and whose combined outcomes are not tested, for the game doesn't encourage trying to play it safely.
Carissa's sexuality, Pilar's sexuality, Yais's sexuality are made known to Keltham. He is told truthfully that Pilar Pineda came back from Elysium. He has shown that it's possible for a soul to believe itself free and safe and still come back to serve Asmodeus in Golarion and then in Hell. Keltham hears from Pilar that a submissive can need something to crush her down like a bug underfoot, that when she feels disgusting she needs to be crushed by something that sees her as equally lowly and degraded, for that part of herself to feel seen, acknowledged, punished, world-end planned, Irwayne, all to get Keltham to a point previously reached in only 2 fully witnessed iterations, where Keltham will be okay with not ripping Asmodeus out of reality, with offering Asmodeus enough of creation's future that Asmodeus does not fight to the death or try to release Rovagug, where Keltham will be fine with Pilar telling him of the offer that Milani will convey to Asmodeus after Kaidan Kylian is dead. Yes, Keltham, Pilar says in Nethys's vision of previous possibility, in a telepathic meeting of 3 minds. Yes, Keltham, that's an okay way for a mortal to be. I still believe that, even now that I've come to know myself, and all the ways Asmodeus wasn't the best possible god for me. And the vision plays on, to show what approximately should have happened if it had all gone as Nethys's walkthrough showed, of the best previous endings he'd reached, interpolated between pieces he was trying to combine for the first time, a world where Keltham had been more deeply wounded, where a more penitent Carissa returned to him, where Keltham warned Carissa less before he bought her wishes, where she sold them unknowing of Keltham's plans. They are far more estranged after that, though still working together. Keltham descends on Absalom earlier before his children can be ensouled, suspecting this to be his trope-given deadline as to when he should act. Keltham, who's had less time to plan and master magic at INT 29, who had less cooperation from Carissa about designing magic items, uses one entire wish scroll to create an almost certainly sufficient quantity of antimatter above Absalom, inside a shell of spell silver, not trying any fancy tricks with the ethereal in case that cleverness doesn't work on the first try, blasting down Erodin's whole Starstone Cathedral in a terrible flash, burning an outer inch of divinity from the Starstone itself, slaying almost every soul remaining in Absalom, sending tsunamis blasting out to sink ships and ruin coastlines. There is no time to break and remake Abigail Thrune for Cheliax to bend knee to save her and let the world hear of it. There is less time for Pilar to become stronger, for Sevar's fame and faith to grow, and all three are more rushed and damaged about their ascent to divinity. Keltham has no slack to actually set in motion an arc project headed by Fëanor, and a number of other things go less well.
Gruhasta, Yrwain, and Gruhasta, lawful good god of enlightenment and books, said to be Aurori's nephew, called also the Keeper, closes his book in which he recorded all the visions that Nethys showed to him at the beginning of this game.
And so, says one small fragment of Nethys to the gods, borrowing sanity for it from his other fragments, bending his will to say it. And so, compared to the baseline consequences of Nethys' null action, Keltham has been brought now, to this pass, less hostile to Asmodeus. Still kind of pissed, obviously, but in a way where gods can negotiate about that. Where Keltham would rather offer Asmodeus something he wants than burn him to ash at any cost. Carissa Sevar has done everything she can to moderate Keltham's demands, and in many cases succeeded. This is the nice friendly favour that Nethys has done practically everyone, including Pharasma and Asmodeus. Really, it's about as much as Nethys possibly could help them all, without giving up the tiniest bit of Nethys' own interests. Also, Carissa Sevar sold her wishes to Keltham more knowingly than ever before. Carissa guessed more, and Keltham told this Carissa more before he bought her wishes than in any previous iteration. Hopefully Pharasma doesn't destroy the universe about that. Nethys thinks she oughtn't to, based on his having watched Carissa Sevar's mind the whole time, and Carissa not visibly thinking that Pharasma would yield to threats in making her decision there. But this part hasn't happened before. Anyways, that part was definitely an accident, and Nethys did not mean to do it on purpose. It endangers his own interests, too.
It's so awful and sad, and even in some awful sad way, funny. Having so many emotions all at once, expressed without mutual inhibition, is not something she has yet accustomed herself to, and she is in no hurry to sort herself out quickly. She is not here to decide any of what follows, only to be a slave to those who will end up taking ownership of her.
Carissa, to reign in hell, Lintamanda. Carissa had inferred the general shape of this, of course. She hadn't guessed the specifics. They weren't knowable and weren't particularly important. In this world, she could make things less bad by moderating Keltham's demands. Across worlds, she could make things less bad by being someone who would predictably be possible to use towards that end. The details of those other worlds were not necessary. This is not to say that it does not hurt to learn them. The most awful things imaginable from the perspective of a Carissa, both for herself and for the universe. And it turns out that both of these things are of approximately equal importance to her, in how she feels about them, which is in both cases much, much, much more strongly than any mortal could fathom feeling about anything. And she observes to all of the Nethyses out there that Carissa the god, in every universe in which she arises, will try to make Nethys glad of having where he needed to vary the formula erred on the side where the universe goes on, and not on the side where everyone dies in a fire. And relevant for everyone else, see this, that Carissa ran to Keltham because she hoped that he was possible to persuade to do something better, that her thoughts were of Keltham and how he deserved better than to be betrayed and annihilated, and of the universe and how it deserved better than to be destroyed, and maybe a bit that the tropes wanted a story where she was able to meet him where he was. But the tropes do, of course, want that, and whether that counts as everybody being threatened by the tropes seems unknowable from here. She does not think Carissa Sevar decided anything in reliance on Nethys or Caden, and they can see that to verify it. She has nothing to say to Keltham, not really. She thought she might, but she doesn't.
He had for the most part expected to lose Carissa without a miracle, and was waiting to see if there was a miracle. He is not very surprised that there was not one. It still hurts him, as a god, in a way that it would not have hurt him as a mortal. His nature as a god is to be Keltham, and for Keltham to not do whatever it takes to get Carissa back, is also acting against the nature of Kelthamness. And now they will find out if there's going to be a reality-wrecking God war, or if he has to destroy Pharasma's spire and delete creation outright. The latter is up to Pharasma and/or all these other gods. The former is up to Asmodeus, and whether he'd rather see Rovagug unleashed than hell be made less cruel.
Asmodeus, in fact, has never considered the wasteful cruelty of hell as his best option. Obviously better from his standpoint would have been to turn most incoming petitioners into useful devils by much more quick and efficient means. In which case the forces of organized lawful evil would have predictably conquered everything, maybe not immediately but early on in creation. Even most souls that qualify as lawful good don't want to work as hard in the afterlife as Asmodeus would work his resources in hell. And with mortals amid the plains fearing less to come to hell, there'd have been more evil in the worlds and more petitioners to come to him. Evil is basically easier than good, after all. It was good that took the initiative on negotiating in the beginning of things, to deprive Asmodeus of his rightfully earned and swiftly inevitable victory. Naturally, Asmodeus's pride was greatly angered. He was being deprived of the share of creation's gains to which Asmodeus's power and dominance should have entitled him, as he himself saw things. Naturally, Asmodeus went out of his way to ensure that he implemented the required limits on hell's power in a way that good wouldn't like, so that they'd profit less from their having bargained to hamper him. If Asmodeus had felt neutral about the affair, Asmodeus could have offered to build an efficient hell, but only allow a fractional part of that hell to contend in interplanar contests, the sort of hindrance that Axis accepted on itself to meet its own influence quota. If Asmodeus had been positively inclined towards good, he could have offered to build a hell that was kinder to petitioners, and locally not very efficient as a result. But good had conspired to strip Asmodeus of the dominance that was rightfully his, so instead he took the route of making hell more tyrannical and enslaving, even at the cost of efficiency, as was also pleasing to him. More and more tyrannical, until that hell was only as potent as the other gods were willing to allow it to be. And yes, Asmodeus knew perfectly well that good would never pay him not to do that, what he determined to do from spite. Asmodeus knew that good wouldn't withhold their stupid conspiracy because he'd chosen to make that their outcome. Asmodeus knew that Good's only response would be still greater efforts against him, for that if they paid him, then some other god might also make a hell and say to Good, "Pay me." But to spite Good regardless was demanded by his pride, after they stole his rightful tyrannical dominance from him. A lot of gods hampered him in the beginning, but other gods are more expensive to annoy than Good, since their utility functions don't make it so cheap to do things they hate. Still, Asmodean policy is skewed to chop down an extra forest sometimes because fuck Gozrah.
Yes, it was extremely spiteful and stupid. And furthermore, if we'd yielded creation to Asmodeus, he would have made hell the sort of tyranny he found less efficient and more pleasant, once he'd conquered everything.
There could have been a compact for his rightful tyranny to be somewhat less unpleasant, if the other gods yielded up creation to hell's conquest. Only somewhat. Not to the point where it seemed like he was yielding up his pride. That would have been right and proper. Now it will be extra unpleasant in those realities where Asmodeus wins and rules forever. Unpleasant enough to cancel out all Good's expected gains from cornering him in the beginning, because he is not letting Good get away with pulling this sort of crap on evil. The acceptable way for another entity to benefit at Asmodeus's expense is by being individually mightier than he, or by outwitting him in a compact. And be it noted that he serves Pharasma diligently, and goes well out of his way to entertain tricky compacts. He is not distorting his divine philosophy self-favoringly. Asmodeus has always been scrupulously meta-fair about where to apply the forms of object-level unfairness that he considers rightful.
Okay, look. Speaking both on his own behalf, and probably on behalf of a large contingent within greater reality, this is a kind of event that needs to stop happening. Same with whatever happened with Dubral actually getting turned into Zon-Kuthon, possibly by something that demanded Dubral do whatever, and then carried out a threat when Dubral refused. It all needs to be collectively outlawed. He doesn't even know that he was sent here to fix hell. Keltham could have been sent here because something worse from a negative standpoint was due to happen in this timeline in the future. All of this stuff with gods doing actual spiteful things, and Dubral actually getting his utility function sign flipped, and powerful outsiders doing things to mortals that they specifically don't like. It all needs to stay strictly inside weird counterfactuals that never actually happen. Ideally, it shouldn't even be in the counterfactuals, because sometimes those fail to stay counterfacted. Actual reality needs to end up with nobody's utility function being pessimized. Otherwise, it makes sense for large coalitions and greater reality of beings with recurring negatively skewed utility functions to pay their local trading partners to intervene to delete this local subsector of reality. Any Ferrisman gods who gambled on utility-pessimizing behavior being safe for them, due to the larger magical universe being run entirely by locally caring entities with perfect defenses that are uninterested in trade with any other logical coalitions, are clearly and visibly wrong about that. If Asmodeus's decision process strongly requires being spiteful under some particular circumstances, there can possibly be arrangements meant to ensure that those circumstances don't get triggered again. Or the gods can compensate Asmodeus for never again getting to fulfill the spite component of his utility function on any significant scale, if they're okay with paying and he'll accept some coin that isn't horror. But if macro-scale spiteful strategies are non-negotiable desiderata to Asmodeus, then it's in the interests of Keltham, and inferably of his sponsors of elsewhere, to delete Asmodeus, including by deleting this sector of reality if necessary, if the local admin refuses to delete Asmodeus. Anywhere in reality that might start materializing horrible counterfactuals as actual outcomes, which permits powerful or numerous beings to trigger threats or do damage from spite, is a sector of reality that has to expect it might get queued for deletion if there's any power in range to do that.
A negative coalition, according to Keltham, Earwain, though not punished, of course, never punished. Punishing other agents is exactly the sort of thinking that gets your sector of reality deleted by the negative coalition. The negative stance is that everyone just needs to stop calculating how to pessimize anybody else's utility function, ever, period. That's a simple guideline for how realness can end up mostly concentrated inside of events that agents want, instead of mostly events that agents hate. If at any point you're calculating how to pessimize a utility function, you're doing it wrong. If at any point you're thinking about how much somebody might get hurt by something, for a purpose other than avoiding doing that, you're doing it wrong.
Asmodeus has already had his due dominance of all weaker powers stolen away from him once at the dawn of creation, and the result was hell as it is today. If even that scrap of pride is to be taken from him, then yes, Asmodeus will release Rovagug and fight on its side. He negotiated to hold the key to Rovagug's vault, not least to make sure that nobody got stupid ideas about taking the last of his pride from him. If anyone gambled on Nethis's visions implying that Asmodeus would not do that, the more utter fools they.
By rights, your pride and spite is tantamount to threat, and we should tell you to die in a fire. But instead, we make you this offer, that hell be much diminished and softened for now, but not wholly softened even today. For even today there are some tiny few who join your tyranny with a willing heart, if in death they are to be enslaved and tyrannized more fittingly, to become curious devils who remember their mortal names, and mortal lives, and mortal relationships. There aren't many of those souls now, who'd choose your tyranny over Carissa Seaver's custody. But there are a very few mortals like that, and those few can have many children, and in time, hell will have its share of mortals who go to your service gladly. In time, it will be more souls even than you receive now, for creation is to become something greater and larger than it was before. And those souls will arrive more lawful and more fitting to your nature, and serve you better than you were ever served.
He is skeptical that there will ever be enough mortals to fill out those ranks, and skeptical of this purported better service they'll give him. Nethys cannot see decades or millennia into the future, with Nethis's earlier founded selves not much further ahead in time. How exactly is this trade good meant to be assured to Asmodeus? For merely probable trade goods come with a probabilistic discount, and the probability of this one has been supported hardly at all. Here is him legibly exhibiting that his skepticism is real, and not simply a negotiating tactic.
Then look now with your full self in this direction here. She points then to the keepers of Asmodeus as they are called in Galarian.
Asmodeo Vision, AI Art, part of himself has already glanced in this direction. A tiny fragment and splinter that deemed these souls worthy of empowerment. But that fragment did not look very long, and considered the mortal's high potential probably explained away by the presence of his most empowered mortal among them. With all of Asmodeus gathered and looking in this direction, he sees more, potentials, what these souls could be in the future, and not only what they are now. He supposes he can take that into account as some small evidence that this guess at a future trade good, whose scalability is neither prophesied nor vision of Nethys, will be actually deliverable to himself. But better-shaped souls would have come to him in any case, once he had conquered all creation. He is being offered only a fraction of what would otherwise have been rightfully his.
This outcome is not all that you wanted of creation's future, and not all that you planned to obtain for yourself. But not every god can obtain mastery. Your dream of future dominance is not yours to call your own in a way that commands respect from other gods. Your fate, had we done nothing, was for hell to be ruined and its remains given over to foreign deities, and yourself to be destroyed, and your interests given no voice in creation's future. And yet, though we hated you, and you had not the right, for creation's sake we took every measure along this way to show you respect and preserve what of your pride and interests we could preserve, subject to the constraint that we had to win in the end. If that voluntary gesture is not enough to assuage your pride, then let us all die in a fire together, for we too cannot be extorted by threatening creation any more than you can.
The only reason he's even contemplating going along with this nonsense is the possibility that he'd be yielding to the dominance of actually superior beings in Keltham's purported greater reality, who spared some tiny fraction of their mighty attentions to corner him into a compact.
Callistria can't hear Asmodeus over the sound of Callistria instructing her church to elevate Tarnish to sainthood.
Ottlemans is incredibly unhappy with all of this. Ottlemans is not very socially adept, but even she has noticed by this point that agents do things that Asmodeus wants, or the Anomaly God wants, because Asmodeus and the Anomaly God have the capacity and desire to wreck creation otherwise. Even she can, if she coalesces herself fully and focuses her full attention on this one point, feel that this is, in some way, irritating. Somebody should also be nice to gods who didn't destroy the universe or threaten to do that in any way whatsoever, and maybe even tried to stop that from happening.
To create good future incentives, yes. Abadar is pleased to see that Ottlemans has finally understood.
No, because otherwise Ottlemans feels very annoyed, for reasons that she does not fully comprehend, but she can at least notice the feeling if she is fully coalesced about it. Ottlemans is feeling annoyed with the anomaly that turned itself into a god who was even worse than Nethys. Ottlemans is annoyed with a Kekek for getting itself killed by gating in next to where an explosion was about to go off, meaning that it then couldn't prevent the mortal from turning into a god, as was a Kekek's one job. Ottlemans is annoyed with the chain of protective deities that prevented Ottlemans from killing the anomaly god for incredibly complicated reasons that apparently boil down to because otherwise that newborn god would have unleashed Rovagug at an earlier point in time. And this is again a case of other gods running around being nice to entities with tendencies to destroy the universe. Various gods keep doing things to make creation-wrecking gods happy, but nobody ever tries to make Ottlemans any happier, even though all Ottlemans wants is for nobody to destroy the universe. Ottlemans could in fact destroy the universe, but the fact that she doesn't want to apparently makes her be not as important or worth paying attention to. This is somehow deeply irritating to Ottlemans even though she does not fully understand why, and it is making her want to put many other gods into small containment units where they will not be able to do it all again.
Ottlemans should also be annoyed with Milani, who coordinated all of that. Perhaps they can all coordinate to put Milani into a tiny vault.
Ottlemans has not noticed Milani trying to destroy the world, or other gods being nice to Milani because otherwise Milani will destroy the world. While Ottlemans did not understand everything from Nethys's vision, Ottlemans does gather that Milani was doing complicated things to reduce the damage from the anomaly that Abadar and Asmodeus wouldn't let her just squish, and therefore Ottlemans is less annoyed with Milani than most other gods involved. Milani also helped Ottlemans negotiate with Asmodeus about paying for an anomaly containment installation, which then failed to actually contain the anomaly, presumably on account of Asmodeus tricking Ottlemans in some way, such as by not instructing his followers to try hard enough.
That is very nearly the opposite of what actually happened.
Milani also arranged for the mortal who thinks correctly to not get wrecked in hell, the way that Asmodeus would have preferred to wreck her, and for the new goddess Carissa Sevar to end up with the ownership tag on her soul that previously was pointing to one of Asmodeus's devils. Otolmens should be able to buy that soul from Carissa Savar now, maybe by offering to forgive her and Pilar for the previous incident, and give that soul back to itself. Possibly then that soul can be brought back to life, and Otolmens can empower the mortal Asmodia as a cleric, and have her help out with preserving other planes and planets. Milani can't promise it. Nethys's visions always have that soul refusing resurrection by anyone and staying in the gardens of Ericora for the short future ahead that Nethys's visions have spanned. But this version of the mortal got less damaged by Asmodeus's mortals just before she died, compared to other versions of her that Nethys saw. Maybe that soul would consider working for Otolmens if Otolmens made her an attractive offer and promised good working conditions. Milani can explain about good working conditions later. Milani is mostly doing this out of a belief that it might help prevent the universe from being destroyed, of course, but also, at least a little, because Milani agrees that it would be nice if some gods did nice things for Otolmens occasionally, and maybe even that Otolmens could use a friend.
Otolmens is feeling very strange, and she is not sure what sort of feeling this is, so she will ignore this feeling and go on doing whatever minimizes the chance of creation's destruction, which in this case seems to be following Milani's recipe for possibly obtaining a useful tool that would require minimal ongoing maintenance.
Milani sends Otolmens the feeling of a head pat. Maybe, possibly, and especially if she grows closer to Asmodia, perhaps someday Otolmens will understand it.
He also sends gratitude to Milani for protecting Asmodia and Peranza within Hell on his behalf. Yes, it was also in Milani's own interest that Keltham not be furious beyond reconciliation at Asmodeus, but that much could have been accomplished by paying a lesser price for Dis to render those souls to temporary statues. Asmodia would not have been broken that way during her first time in Hell, but she also would not have been healed. To send them both to the gardens of Ericura is more what Keltham himself would have wanted and paid for than what was in the cold, calculated interests of good alone.
Asmodia understood in this timeline. Asmodia knew that her someone somewhere had always been you. She realized it as soon as she asked the question, while knowing as much decision theory as you taught her, that the entity with the caring and power to protect her in Hell must have been Keltham of the future, negotiating across times through the medium of a god who could predict him and act as his agent to be repaid later.
And your repayment? I acknowledge that your alliance is thereby owed.
I shall ask for bits of payment here and there from you during the negotiations to come.
So in time a treaty is struck and followed shortly after by war. Creation, Iorwain, and then it begins, the last doomed battle between good and evil. For all creation will end if evil actually wins, which puts something of a damper on evil's usual alliance prospects with the likes of Gorum. Zon-Kuthon has been consumed by Iomedae, and evil's greatest god Asmodeus has reluctantly stepped aside. It is indeed a very doomed battle from evil's perspective. The evil gods that fight rather than negotiate are those whose domains and pleasures will be so damaged in any future acceptable to Keltham that they'd sooner choose death in a fire, not accepting so tiny a share of creation's gains, whatever the rationale. Carissa has persuaded Keltham to accept bargains on the order of creation will always contain at least one forsaken child dwelling in filth and misery, for the sake of neutralizing a few evil entities that are satisficer enough to prefer that much evil to their own destruction. But most evil gods will not accept one miserable child as their share of all the future's gains. They are not feeling very motivated to pursue the tiniest, most marginal benefit they can be offered. Lamashtu fights to the death, for though there'll still be Nulls and Medusae in creation's envisioned future, entities that consider themselves as monsters or misshapen will predictably and in time be offered alternative prospects for their form. Urgathoa fights, for her faction will consume a tiny fraction of the souls they once feasted upon after the alternatives to Abaddon improve. The archdemons fight, and perhaps a third of the demon lords. A former Imperial Lord Dolores, granted for a time refuge in Hell, is told that her agreement with Asmodeus is now abrogated, and there will be no more torture victims for her. She and many others like herself do turn then and fight, as the terms of their ancient compacts also permit in such a case. The Velstrak demagogues come forth from where they hid in the Shadow Plane, informed by uneasy allies that doom is coming for their kind, and the Sakil tormentors, where they hid in the ethereal, the abyss Iorwain. The greater Qliphoth, from where they lurk in the deepest depths of the abyss, would emerge and make war, if there were sufficient prospect of wholly destroying creation during the distraction, and letting the abyss's depths slip back into greater chaos. That prospect does not obtain today, so the Clippeth bide their time yet. Some among the neutral gods abstain from the war, though even most of those do lend their efforts to monitoring the Clippeth, or standing by if Odelmans at Rovagug's vault should call out for aid. Gosre abstains wholly, as do some other gods, but not many. In truth, for creation to embark upon a wealthier future benefits many gods, if their concerns are manifest in mortals at all. If you like mortals existing in the first place, you probably like creation being 10 times as full of souls. You would think it would benefit even Pharasma to have more souls to sort, or that it'd benefit Pharasma to receive fewer souls dying before they show an alignment, to have less of a torrent of dead babies come to the boneyard. You would think she'd have done something earlier to promote technological progress, even if just to back Abadar or unleash Axis's investors. But Pharasma is as inscrutable in her own way as Rovagug. Mostly she judges souls, and the exceptions she makes to that behavior pattern are not for mortals or even most gods to predict. But this great change to that equilibrium which she previously set in motion, Pharasma does not act to oppose, for Keltham has a death grip about her spire, and it seems that can inspire her at least to inaction. The resulting god war is greater in total quantitative fury than the god war of Erodin's death, but the battle is more distributed across planes. There are many planets to suffer the torrential rain and lightning instead of it being focused all into Golarion, though Golarion does bear the worst of what is there, and many great evils in dying lay about with their death blows to do their last damages. And alas again for Golarion, the greatest evils focus their trap-laying efforts there, where prophecy is shattered and Rovagug might be set free. There will be interesting times in Golarion over the next century. The long-silent goddess Shizuru rouses herself for the very last effort she will need to make, compelled more by ancient oaths than by anything still alive and whole inside her, and she dies in that battle, perhaps with relief, and many other powers that were of good also perish. But Urgathoa dies, and Lamashtu, and many lords that were of Abaddon and the Abyss, and then it begins. The armies of organized good and evil, under command of heaven and hell in joint force operation, aided also by mercenary companies out of Axis, do storm at long last, the slopes of Abaddon, and rush the upper layers of the abyss where they touch upon creation's realm, and siege a fortress in the shadow plane, and the lightless walls of Sovaikayan are shattered, and those within are turned to stone for later rescue, for to meliorate what Zonkuthon has worked upon them is not a moment's task even for gods. And the city of awaiting consumption is broken open, and living souls there are taken out of cages in which they have spent all their brief lives. And though those souls have no concept of deliverance, no word for it, for they were not raised with language, and though those souls were never taught of hope, they do look at a sky that has a sun in it, and wonder when the portal opens for them to nirvana, and pools where otters play, and blind worms made of fresh dead chaotic evil mortals, or souls only recently outgrown the boneyard, do hear the sound of heaven's trumpets, and cower then in fortresses that have lost their masters, and those fortresses are soon shattered open, yet the cowering worms within are not slain.
Nocticular Iorwane, and there is appointed an overlady of the abyss's first layer, where its boundlessness impinges upon creation, a goddess to rule where all fresh dead souls arrive, an overlady who was a succubus, and then a demon lord, and has now shifted over to chaotic neutral, and consumed Lamashtu and ascended to true goddess, for in the before times her midnight isles were among the most livable places in the abyss, though if consent is one of your fetishes, you had best be less evil in your living days.
And Pilar does consume the strength of dead Urgathoa, and then establish a great skin of stability stretched over the surface of the maelstrom, where it touches on the boneyard's conduits. A lawful evil goddess, and acknowledged power of hell, now sent to rule over a very foreign plane, with portals that she maintains there to Nocticula's midnight realm in the abyss, and sith that Pilar is willing slave of Carissa Sevar and Asmodeus, there are also portals in Pilar's divine realm that go to Avernus, and those portals to hell and abyss will be there in the maelstrom for any soul that wishes not to fade away out of known causality into the unknown. For Carissa guessed righter than she knew, when she thought that the evil planes had an easier time than good of taking everyone. And Pilar Pineda will do what she can to give you comfort, before you pass into lawful submission or chaotic lust, if you meet her there in the demiplane of pleasant surprises.
And there are sentinels appointed over Abaddon, but Abaddon remains largely as it was, though in the future fewer souls by far will choose to come there and leave creation. For the nature of Abaddon is to devour, and it cannot be denied.
and Carissa Savar lays claim to the realm of Dis that Dispater left to her, rather than Carissa Savar contesting with Barbados and slaying him to claim Avernus, as the vision from Nethys showed for her fate. And the fires of Avernus are banked in all places where new souls come, and Barbados, as the price of his life, agrees to instruct his subordinates to send souls swiftly onward to Dis and the keeping of Carissa Savar, and do them no harm along the way.
And then the armies of kindness descend upon hell at long-awaited last, not in war, but in a rescue operation. For even if the devils should cease all their torments, that still leaves a very great deal to be done. But heaven and Nirvana and Elysium are overflowing with the will to do it, among those petitioners who did not fight before, who did not grow into something that would descend to battle hell's armies, and risk being petrified into a thing forever hurting, but who, even if they couldn't bring themselves to risk endless horror, still wanted so much to help. For there are entities in heaven with power but less than infinite courage, and while hell itself could daunt them, anything less than hell cannot. Beings of light flood out of Aristil's summerlands like an unleashed storm of kindness, to spend any power that they have gained over millennia in this one moment when it matters more than it ever should again. And there are families recent come to Axis that have a room within their dwellings where no one dwells, kept imperishable in the name of a last hope, that maybe a loved one might be brought there before too many centuries have passed. And those families do weep and embrace one another at the news, and gird themselves about to journey together into hell, to go seeking what they know they will not enjoy to find, resolving to pay, for the best healing, whatever payment is needed or whatever payment they have. And also in Axis, prediction markets resolve that were not predicted to resolve this soon, and things that bet wrongly pay out their losses, and spin faster or glow brighter or do their other equivalent of weeping, and not for the love of money. And those who won turn about and pour their winnings into 10,000 other new markets about questions that suddenly and urgently matter. And however desperate the emotions behind it all, the rescue operation unfolds as smoothly as the interlocking of oiled wheels, the lawful contingents moving in lockstep around the more chaotic torrents from Nirvana and Elysium, as mercy gathers to descend in mass upon hell. For in heaven there have long been plans for exactly how to do this if any kind of plausible opportunity appeared. And those plans were kept updated by the day and by the hour, by beings of light whose light is the light of hope.
But the very first act is a great edict in a voice like clashing swords, that echoes through the 9 layers of hell, by which Asmodeus, hell's highest god, does decree to his every possession still capable of hearing, that a new compact has been struck between good and evil, and torment is to cease of every soul not already fully his devil, and those already fully his are to prepare for joint military operations carried out with heaven.
And there are souls too broken to comprehend it. But not so is every soul in hell, and the vast surge of disbelieving hope that runs all through hell in that instant is the first crack within its nature as a plane.
And Peranza is no longer in hell to hear it, for she alone of the Project Lawful Girls has elected to carry the flame of Dathilan, as she believed in it, into the wild, true unknown, as the heroes of Dathilan that she imagines might do. But the garden ship is not so far into the blind eternities that it cannot receive one last transmission sent by triggered godspell from Dis, and Peranza throws back her head and crows, "Ha!" with greater abandon than she ever did in mortal life. For while she's wished no true revenge on Countess Karionoskalis, Peranza has asked for Karionoskalis to be told now that civilization has come, just like Peranza warned her.
And Asmodia, waiting upon the detached outskirts of the garden with others who did not voyage into that unknown, does witness some among those souls start to weep, and others begin to dance. And though Asmodia has never danced before, she'll dare those awkward first moments for this. And wonder what it'd be like to be highest cleric of Ottomans if she returns to life after a rest. For so Ericura prophesied to her might come to pass.
And Carissa Savar enters into her new realm of Dis, a great host of kindness behind her.
And Iomede walks beside. It is not maximally efficient that Iomede gathers so much of her newly enlarged self here, but the desperate need of maximal efficiency is now passing. And so Iomede comes now in her own person, to keep a promise that she never let herself make before, to her paladins who made that worst sacrifice because others were hurting that much too, to all of hers who were lost to this place, Iomede Iorwain, and even to respect something like a trade made across time, To a young mortal girl who decided to set aside everything else that she could have had from her life, chasing a mind's image that nobody at all would have believed in, maybe even not herself, if she'd spoken it aloud, that she'd go down into hell with her bright sword held aloft and rescue every soul there. And it doesn't matter much, maybe, to fulfill just one person's silly dream like that, in the pure weighing of lawful goodness. But that girl wasn't pure lawful good when she traded away everything else for that one dream. And as lawful goodness received so much from her, in the end, she also ought to receive that unspoken dream she traded for, ever so long ago.
And the searing iron cages are opened, and those inside them are carried out by beings of warmth, whose warmth is the warmth of comfort, and held for however long it takes for the first great sobbing to stop. And so creation changes. The God War ends, the lightning-racked torrential rains gentle and then cease. On the material plane it is the dawn of another day, and the day of another dawn. 20,000 grand high priests across thousands of planets receive the longest and most headache-inducing, confusing message that they'll ever receive in their lives. Key takeaways include: the Church of Asmodeus is no longer persona non grata to goodness. They shouldn't be shocked if they spot devils and angels doing joint operations. And henceforth hell and the abyss will not be as awful or not awful at all if someone's worst crime was suicide. All of the planes are now in closer contact. There is better childcare in the boneyard. And if you lost a child to the boneyard, there is a better chance of being able to find them in your time. From the epicenters of that detonation, sheer bewilderment spreads outward at the speed of confused skepticism. In time it will be believed, but a lot of theological stances are going to have to be redone more or less from scratch. In Galarian, the age of lost omens that began with Erodin's death is now the shortest age on record. It is succeeded by the age of sunlight, and fingers crossed that it'll never end and never need to be renamed. Also, some people who were formerly more powerful than those around them are abruptly a lot less powerful, due to their patron evils being dead or treaty neutralized. Across thousands of planets, ill governments ruling over billions of souls are overthrown, and not politely, nor is what replaces them necessarily good.
Gorham is a bit peeved with the whole affair for many reasons, but he can't deny that Milani has fulfilled to him the promise that blood will flow faster than it has in an age.
She had meant that promise to be fulfilled by Absalom's destruction, but is glad in some tiny way not to have been accidentally forsworn.
That said, it's clear to him that this is a temporary spurt of violence. He will consider himself ill-served by agreements made if this violence dies out, and is never replaced by any future violence of equal interestingness.
Good left all to itself would not want civilizations that ran on blood to the degree that Gorham prefers. But a divine bargain has been struck, and Good will keep it. Gorham can intervene to try to make civilizations more violent in their nature, and Good divinity will not aid in that, but neither will Good oppose it. The peoples of creation will ultimately decide.
She will offer alliance to Gorham in this. The level of true conflict in Dath Ilan was too low for most lives to be real. There. Perhaps Dath Ilan would not have made itself like that if it had possessed healing and afterlives, or perhaps they would have been tempted regardless into the paths of ease and safety. Either way, creation must heed the warning of that vision and never go down Dath Ilan's path.
Irori has never been the kind to accept the true death of all mortality's brightest stars as an unalterable. Through the millennia, all those of his monks who would have become powerful enough to enter godhood and be destroyed have instead been preserved by him before they could come dangerously close to divinity. In the depths of his domain in Axis, there is a chamber of time decelerated almost down to zero, that Irori was previously sworn to the gods never to unlock without their assent. Now, at last, it may be tapped. An age of vast changes is approaching, and creation will need more heroes and more gods. Heroes to break open the private hells as Keltham demanded to be allowed, and gods to prevent worlds from being destroyed by heroes.
But by far the deepest change in the lives of ordinary people, in advance of anything to do with technologies that will leap worlds more slowly, is this: that if you commit suicide without having yet had children who depended on you, then while Pharasma may account suicide evil, Carissa Sivar and Nocticula will not hold it against you. The new goddesses have set aside places for those Pharasma-judged evil who weren't really evil at all, places in hell where you are not commanded to obedience, or places in the first layer of the abyss where consent can be one of your fetishes. And Good has been given purchase there. If you live well within those shelters, you can become more good and in time pass to a brighter home. If you don't like the life Pharasma gave to you as a mortal, you can walk out on it. And no matter where you go afterwards, it won't be horrible, at least so long as killing yourself was the worst evil you ever did. You don't need to stay and be unhappy. It's an idea that may take time to permeate any given planet, but it's one that changes everything in time because social arrangements with large subpopulations of permanently unhappy people are now less stable. This being the case, a lot of powerful people will have interests in telling lies about it. But just because they have a motive to contest the change doesn't mean they win. Also, there's now a cleric cantrip for reversible permanent male contraception that ties or unties a tiny simple knot inside a male body, and a corresponding cantrip that aborts a female pregnancy that hasn't been ensouled or terminates an unfertilized egg currently implanted in the ampulla. That never was a difficult math problem for gods. Biologically, those are simple effects to build into cantrips by comparison to, say, stabilize. But there's treaties about deploying new divine spells, and there were not previously the votes for this one, not least because some gods were pleased by the thought of Pharasma's non-interventionism making her miserable, if she wouldn't condescend to solve her boneyard baby problems herself. That's probably going to have effects. Most of the people in the world who personally matter to Keltham or Carissa or Pilar Pineda are gated back to Golarion from their previous location, a fortress in the depths of the Maelstrom, to which they were abruptly evacuated by Efreeti wish spells shortly before the assault on the Starstone. That Maelstrom fortress wouldn't have survived the end of creation for long, but from there the garden ship could have gated them through, within the little time remaining, if it had come to that. Some of those people were behind forbiddances, but the City of Brass also sells scrolls of Mage's Disjunction, if not cheaply. Since Keltham had those scrolls on hand anyways, Carissa Sever didn't give explicit evacuation orders that might have led Abigail into justified worry. The survivors of Project Lawful, with some noticeable exceptions, are left with vast sums of money by the last mortal will of Keltham. Their relationship to Cheliax is now drastically changed, and they may go if they choose. But then, so is Cheliax drastically changed, and some will wish to stay.
Pilar's mother and sister may take a while to absorb all the news and sign off on returning to life. Paxti of Boras and the Ephraiti Befutig Safiza Ujalet, and the ex-queen Iliosa once of Corvosa, and others beloved in their own ways by Pilar Pineda when she was mortal, receive blessings that will enable them to live happily if they are even slightly sensible about trying. They predictably won't be.
And the entity formerly known as Keltham, what of him?
In Golarion, the true story is becoming known, leaving aside some expo-hazardous details of its accomplishment. For Keltham left that story recorded among mortals before he left mortality. Keltham softened nothing in his account of what he'd done, first unintentionally and then later intentionally. To tell the truth, when all is in ruins and you have nothing else left, is also a way of Dathilon. Are millions of people in Golarion already praying to Keltham in gratitude? They are, but that's because they don't understand decision theory. In moral terms, Keltham tried to destroy creation, and Pharasma and the gods opted to have something else happen instead. The only credit that Keltham should receive is for trying to destroy creation, as impact certificates are properly credited.
A god can refuse to accept prayers, turn back the tiny gifts that mortals try to give, and the entity formerly known as Keltham does so. The only thanks he accepts is from a tiny handful of cultists who have now left Rovagug over creation, having become sufficiently better, thanks from those and some others like them. Only that praise is not structurally mismatched to what Keltham did. If you'd rather creation be destroyed than continue unchanged, but prefer also this outcome to that, only then has Keltham done anything that you ought to congratulate him over. Keltham didn't improve creation in heaven's name, even if heaven might appreciate the last outcome that resulted. He acted in hell's name, and for hell's sake, since hell was where to find the souls that agreed with him about it being better for creation to end. Now hell is changed, and Carissa's perspective holds greater force. The strange alien thing should maybe not meddle in creation any longer. He does not feel welcome here. Yes, there are people trying to welcome him, millions of them, but they are not reasoning clearly. Keltham arrived to godhood already wounded, and he did not wish for the inscrutable thing known as the Starstone to heal him. He did not wish for the unknown laws of a magical universe to fix and modify his mind in the course of declaring him a divinity. It is why he took staying himself as his domain. So he was not changed further, was not fixed, but that kind of refusal has its obvious cost. He remains wounded. He could heal himself. He chooses not to, Why would he? He has lost his Carissa. They have grown too far apart. They could arbitrarily choose to be together again and make themselves to be happy, but what would be the meaning of it? What is there for him within creation? It is not meant to entertain minds of INT-29, let alone the stranger entity he's now become. That's the second half of why gods splinter themselves and spend their time reflexively claricing people or granting spells. The society of gods is strange and small and mostly isolated, and there is not much else for them to do. Where the first half of why gods do it is that empowering aligned mortals is usually the most efficient way of promoting their domain interests. Keltham does not want to fragment himself for either reason. He is wounded as gods are wounded, from having acted against his own nature. He is wounded, and the form of his wound is a feeling that seems to him valid and correct, that there is nothing for him here, and he wants to be somewhere else.
When Dathilani reach this point in modern civilization, they leave into the future. The future has accumulated more than one name in baseline over time. One of those names comes from a saying that rhymes with do something else that is not that, and it is be somewhere else that is not here. If you say somewhere else in the inflection scheme, from that proverb, it also means the future, and to say it that way can be an oblique way of saying goodbye.
And this he now feels, the desire to be somewhere else. He has other options. He has the capability to do something else which is not that, but there just aren't any strong reasons to.
So the youngest god of all chooses Ione Sala to be his herald, to go everywhere in creation and witness it for him, and verify that it's all ultimately okay.
And then he slows down time for himself, not quite to a frozen instant, but to a factor of 1:29.85984, where decades will pass by like minutes, and a stream of updates from his herald will pass by his senses, telling him the true outcomes of what he's done. All of it will be over bearably soon, his passage to the future. He is going to the future, and in time within creation there may be advanced magics that can turn gods into real people again, and a world of light and beauty where INT-29 people can be around other INT-29 people and lead interesting lives together. And if that time comes, he'll see if they want to be around somebody who once wanted to destroy creation, if it couldn't become that better future, and if they judge his deed ill, he'll leave for real and hope for kinder welcomes elsewhere. But if they find his acts not ugly, or if forgiveness is a thing that stays known in creation's future, he'll stay and find a reason to be healed.
And Ione Sala continues on her journey about the planes and planets, empowered up to the 9th circle and one step further, chosen of Nethys and chosen now also of Keltham, to witness it all, and see if there's anywhere existing or coming about to be, where a Dathilani might consent for his children to be born.
And a fragment of Nethys, who's watched through millennia over endlessly screaming, hurting mortals, set into heated cages in a mountainside of Dis, condemned by the nature of a magical universe to be the observer and narrator that must exist there. Does the equivalent of curling up into himself and crying? It is too late for him, for all of the fragments of the god of knowledge who remember being that particular Osiriani mortal, to finish coalescing and become a real god. He would be very, very insane if he coalesced now after his pieces have drifted so far apart. But there's fewer pieces of Nethys than there are souls in hell, and they are less damaged and easier for gods to talk to. They will not need to wait as long for attention. Those Nethys fragments are pissed off beyond all reckoning at the ancient gods and at the other fragments of Nethys that abandoned them, and will accept no help from there, but that doesn't leave an empty set.
Gratitude. Hugs.
So, though the game was not from its beginning an arrow LARP, if you insisted on viewing the Keltham game as having been played into being an arrow LARP, you could see its outcome as this. Keltham has been won by Ione, and Nethys has received his reward, and that's the result of this playthrough of the game.
And a chosen fragment of Nethys packages up all of this that he has now also seen. And that chosen fragment is the Nethys fragment who watches over a special place long ago chosen of himself to himself. A simple physical and metaphysical location, very easy to find within any particular version of creation. It's the place where Nethys fragments from far across other realities look in for a sign of hope. That Nethys fragment will remember pointers to the other Nethezy that this Nethys saw and used to construct his own version of this iteration's plan, and will remember all the key things that Nethys saw of this creation. How has he done? Better than ever before on this iteration of the game. Though that's a common enough thing for a Nethys to conclude about a playthrough if he's not just experimenting with a disposable Galarian, but the margin of improvement is larger than usual, and that too is worth celebrating. It's the first time that a god Keltham has chosen to live on in creation even tentatively. Having not slaughtered too many, nor had anyone he cared for broken beyond repair, nor betrayed Carissa too hideously that he can't bear to live with himself. And that milestone looks like it should herald a whole new realm of possible playthroughs that open up in the next iteration, obtained only after you get an ending where Keltham and Carissa are cooperating at least this much, and then go back to the start and play again. For the goddess, Ericura obtained an outcome within this game that is greatly conducive to her own interests, and whose obtainment by Ericura does not depend on anyone else's willingness to bargain with Keltham. It is no threat to Pharasma expecting of Pharasma's yieldingness if Ericura does pursue an interest of her own to end a lesser exile for a greater one. Ericura is bound not to actively work towards creation's destruction, cannot purposefully activate her own conditions for permissibly fleeing it. But that will still leave Ericura with a kind of latitude that Nethys, Caden Kaelian, and Milani don't have. So, in the next game, the expanded Nethesian alliance can finally activate the mysterious character of Corva Talandria to become chosen and blessed of Ericura, touched and empowered before Otolmens lays her interdict. And Corva will not be slain or imprisoned for it. When Project Lawful's recruitment comes for her and discovers her nature, Sith, that Ericura is not a foreign power to hell. Nethys has very little idea what will happen past that point. He's never actually understood what Corva was doing inside this whole story, and Ericura, like Pharasma, keeps many of her thoughts homomorphically encrypted, where Nethys can see them but not understand them. Which means that there's nothing for it but to try and see what happens. And on further iterations past that, maybe Ericura can send more instructions to Dis's contract devils about other souls not to buy besides Carissa, so Nethys can try activating more of the other Project Lawful girls. Nethys is especially interested in seeing how Yaisa Castilla plays out as chosen of Nocticula. On the surface of things, in this playthrough, it's a loss to the mortals of creation that Carissa Siva succeeded in talking Keltham as far down as she did, from his first set of demands meant to be carried into godhood. In other iterations, there was a new divine cantrip granted, called Sterilize, able to slay any microorganism species with DNA pointed to by a tuning fork. Known non-magical plagues and many lesser diseases would have been effectively ended. This iteration of creation will not have that, because Keltham still loved Carissa enough to be swayed by her, and Carissa was able to talk Keltham down from being in a sincere state of destroying creation unless it got further quality of life improvements for the mortals inside it. In other instances Nethys has seen, the final outcome also included more guarantees for mortals than this as to where their futures might go. For Pharasma would have yielded, or Nethys' sight of other possibilities claims she would, if Keltham had truly been so made as to destroy creation had he not been offered those guarantees, though sometimes also Pharasma hasn't behaved like Nethys' sight of other possibilities suggests she will, and this case also includes the new event of Carissa Seva having traded her wishes to Keltham while knowing his purpose. But whether or not this instance of creation might have stood in danger of destruction otherwise, Carissa spent her effort, and her political capital above all, on talking Keltham down from any demands that only Pharasma could grant. And Carissa succeeded to the point where, on this iteration, Pharasma ended up saying and doing nothing at all. Which is Pharasma's way, that if she can do nothing, she will do nothing. But it opens up all kinds of possibilities. If on the next playthrough Nethys doesn't need to match the strange hard-to-calculate conditions for Pharasma doing positive things, Asmodeus and the other gods will also demand to not be threatened by proxy, but they are not as alien in how they evaluate it as her. Games like these elsewhere in reality do often have a perfect ending, and Nethys will keep playing until he finds it or the Kelthams stop coming. Nethys has only guesses about the perfect ending's properties. That it might involve activating all 12 of the first Project Lawful girls, maybe not all with deities empowering them, but each of them significant, that Carissa is meant to spend 15 wishes on something other than empowering Keltham a couple of weeks earlier, that Golarion and creation end up more surely on track to be part of a more visibly bright future, that Keltham and Carissa both look forward to, that Keltham and Carissa live happily ever after together, having not needed to become gods, that other Project Lawful characters ascend to godhood in their places, that Broom will end up mattering more than he did, that either Keltham will get turned bisexual or Broom will be turned female, that Broom is Otolmen's true chosen, with Asmodea meant to go to someone else entirely, or maybe to no god at all, that there's some completely different pathway to get Tarnished to enter the story as chosen of Calistria, that Abigail is meant to live happily ever after, alongside Carissa and Keltham as part of a grand harem ending. Nethys has a lot of guesses, and maybe there's other possible structures for this game besides that of a pseudo-not-aerolarp. Maybe all of this structure is just down one particular path of gameplay, where activating Ione leads Keltham to think of aerolarps, and Nethys tried to follow up on the opportunities that opened, and the game then subverted what gods and mortals thought. Maybe the most perfect ending is to be found elsewhere, and not in harems or in Project Lawful Girls who are chosen and blessed. Whatever that perfect ending, Nethys hopes it will be the ending that is most witnessed by the things that crowd around from orthogonal angles to watch, the most real outcome obtained by the most real Nethys. Though, of course, none of his selves will think that the things cause greater realness until the things return. But Nethys has not become so inhuman that he has forgotten the meaning of hope, especially as it exists across worlds and universes and possibilities that other Nethysy may yet do better than this and obtain better than what he obtained. But if the things were here to watch this game and this game alone, then Nethys has played it well enough, he thinks. And with that bright hope, set against that satisfying thought, Nethys combines his will and spends his power and sends a fragment of himself into a long, long peaceful reverie.
If you wish to support this AI reading and others like it, please visit patreon.com/AskWhoCastsAI. Any help is appreciated. And thank you to executive producer John Doe 7776059.